Hey folks, so why be a tankie? Now for those of you who don't know, on internet web forums and in the lingo of left-wing circles, those who defend the Soviet Union say that the Soviet Union was indeed a socialist country. Those who defend Mao's China say that yes, that China under Mao was indeed socialist. Those who support various countries around the world that have fought to build socialism, those folks are referred to as tankies. Now the term actually goes back to the debates within the British Labour Party in the late 70s. You know, in the late 70s, you had the Italian Communist Party, the French Communist Party, the Spanish Communist Party, distancing themselves from the Soviet Union, criticizing the Soviet Union more. They began calling themselves Euro-communists. So then there was a division in the British Communist Party. Were you a tankie, which was one who defended Soviet military interventions, carried out often with tanks, or were you a Euro, one who was embracing the Euro-communism of the French Communist parties and others? So that's kind of where the term comes from. You know, it conjures up the way that Soviet military interventions were portrayed in Western media as involving, tanks and, the tanks are rolling in and brutal authoritarianism. And it's a division that has taken place. And you get a lot of people that'll say, look, socialism, communism, hey, it's an interesting ideology. No reason not to look into it. No reason not to study those ideas. But why associate yourself with those awful, awful authoritarian regimes? Well, first of all, I'll say that there is no reason that you can't be critical of what went on in the 20th century. Nobody should be a blind apologist. You should be scientific. You should be willing to admit the flaws of socialist countries and governments that exist around the world. No one should be a blind apologist. But there's a reason that in my entire life, as someone believing in socialism, my entire experience as a leftist, I've always dared to defend and uphold the history, despite being critical of the Soviet Union, of different socialist countries. There's a reason for that, and the reason for it is pretty simple. When I was growing up, very small town, conservative town, almost all Republicans, I started getting interested in socialism and communism. It just seemed like common sense when you thought about economics, right? You have lots of unemployed people. Why does the government not make sure that everyone has a job, put them to work doing useful things? There's plenty of work to be done, right? Why does the government not control the major centers of economic power in order to make a better society? Why do we leave everything up to the market? Why do we assume that profits are what's best? It seems pretty clear that the USA is controlled by a lot of very rich people, and a lot of wealthy corporations and bankers run the country. So why not try to set up a situation where that wasn't the case, where you had a government that fought for ordinary people, right? It just kind of seemed like basic common sense. And every time I would bring up these ideas as a youngster, people would say to me, well, that's communism. That's communism. And that failed. Everywhere it's ever been tried, communism failed. The Soviet Union, they tried to have communism, and everyone was just poor and starving and miserable, and they all died, so you can't do that. Or I was told, and in China they tried to have communism, and again, everyone was just poor and starving and miserable, and they all died, and they got away from it. Everywhere communism's ever been tried, everywhere socialism's ever been implemented, all that has happened is everyone has died and suffered and been absolutely miserable. Life got worse. Nothing good ever happened. And this is what most Americans believe. This is what is taught in school. And I assumed it was true. It was what everyone knew. It was what the TV told me. It was what my education system told me. It's what my relatives told me. It's what everyone I knew told me. And so I assumed that was true. But I persisted to be interested in socialist and communist ideas because it seemed exciting, right? And it seemed like capitalism just wasn't working. There was a problem with the fact that you could have empty houses and homeless people. There were problems with capitalism. So I thought, okay, well, maybe there's some other socialists that would be good, that wouldn't be like the bad ones. And so I got interested in Leon Trotsky. And I thought, okay, Trotsky was killed by Stalin, right? Trotsky was an outspoken opponent of the Soviet government. So maybe Trotsky, if I read and study the writings of Leon Trotsky, I can learn about a kind of socialism that might not be like the bad kind, might actually work, and wouldn't result in just everyone being poor and starving and miserable. So I went to the library and I was looking for books by Leon Trotsky, and there was one book in particular that stood out. It had the name Revolution Betrayed, and that was considered to be Trotsky's magnum opus. He wrote it in the late 30s, and this book, The Revolution Betrayed, and I thought, this is the book I'm going to read. This book is going to show me exactly why the Soviet Union was not really socialist and communist. It had betrayed the revolutions, and how if we did it Trotsky's way, it would work. That's what I believed. So I got my hands on The Revolution Betrayed, which is, a widely available book written by Leon Trotsky. I opened it, and the first chapter of Leon Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed, the very first chapter of that book is called What Has Been Achieved. And this was published in the late 30s, and it starts going over all these economic statistics about what the Soviet Union had accomplished. It talked about how the Soviet Union had built some of the largest hydroelectric power plants in the world. It talked about the amount of steel that they were producing. It talked about how they had wiped out illiteracy. It talked about, the amount of grain production that went on. It talked about how they were producing tractors, and more tractors than any other country in the world. And I was reading all of this, and I was puzzled. And I thought, this can't be true, because everybody knows that everywhere that socialism and communism have ever been tried, it's only resulted in people being miserable and starving and dying. Everyone knew that. That was what everyone told me. So I then went to the library, and I checked out encyclopedias, and I read the economics of the Soviet Union in encyclopedias. And lo and behold, it was actually true. The Soviet Union was producing more steel than any other country in the world. The Soviet Union did indeed have a huge oil production apparatus. The Soviet Union had wiped out illiteracy. The Soviet Union had electrified the entire country. The Soviet Union had been the first people in space. And I thought I knew that, but it just never occurred to me, wow, and everything that I had been told was a lie. I mean, the statistics just didn't check out. And I noticed that a lot of books would lie through omission, right? They would have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages on a famine that went on in the early 1930s in Ukraine and about how everyone was starving. And then there'd be like 2 paragraphs about, they also wiped out illiteracy and greatly expanded the life expectancy and were, conquered outer space. But, it was lying through emphasis. They would basically emphasize the hardships the Soviet Union had while overlooking the huge economic achievements they had. And so I would start to tell people, actually, the Soviet Union had huge economic successes in addition to the problems. And people would say to me, you don't really believe that, do you? That's just got to be communist propaganda. Everybody knows that the entire time the Soviet Union existed, everyone was poor and starving and miserable. And the facts just didn't confirm that. And this is all throughout my high school experience, and I would prove to people statistically that yes, indeed, there had been huge economic advances by socialism in the Soviet Union. And I remember when I went to the university, and I had professors at the university, and a lot of them would admit, yes, indeed, there were huge economic achievements, by the Soviet Union. They would criticize the Soviet Union in terms of human rights and other issues, but they would admit this. But then, the second that the right wing would get up and say, and there was always, it was weird. And then when I met the socialist movement, it was the same kind of story, right? And all the socialist groups, people would come up to them and be like, socialism's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. It's never accomplished anything. And rather than try to point out that just objectively wasn't true, they'd be like, that's not real socialism. It was weird. It was weird because it seemed like the entire conversation related to everything about socialism and communism in the United States was premised on a lie, right? The lie wasn't that the Soviet Union had problems and eventually collapsed. The lie wasn't that various countries have had difficulties the lie was that nowhere has socialism ever improved people's lives. Nowhere has socialism ever made things get better. Everywhere that communism or socialism has been implemented, it's only made life worse and it's resulted in people being starving and miserable. That's what most Americans believe about socialism and communism. And it's not true. It's just objectively not true. However, on the socialist left, there's this desire to somehow gain credibility. This belief that, if I denounce those socialist countries, I'll win people over. No, you won't, because people really believe, most Americans believe, that socialism has only made life worse everywhere it's ever been implemented. That's what most Americans believe. And as long as they believe that, saying that, we're going to do it better, is not a logical argument. Right? And if indeed it were true that everywhere socialism had ever been implemented, it had only made life worse, it had no successful results, the right wing and those who denounce socialism would be 100% correct. They would be absolutely right. If every country that had ever implemented socialism had only seen life get worse and killed millions of people and life had just gotten more and more worse, they would be right. They would be absolutely right. But the reality is the Soviet Union was one of the poorest countries in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. And by the 1930s, they were producing more steel than ever before. They electrified the entire country. By the 1950s, they were in outer space. right? The reality is, at the beginning of the 20th century, China was the sick man of Asia, one of the poorest countries in the world. Today, China is the second largest economy on earth. China still today maintains a very state-controlled, planned economy. The myth of the 20th century, this mythology that everywhere you've ever had socialism, it's done nothing but make people suffer and die, that is most Americans' objection to socialism and communism. Even liberals, even far leftists, right? Most of them believe this mythology. And until you demolish this mythology, you shouldn't be talking about socialism or communism. You really shouldn't. I feel like a lot of people that are attracted to these ideas are looking for some kind of perfect solution. They were hoping the Soviet Union would be, paradise or utopia or heaven on earth. Well, such things don't exist. And the Soviet Union did have huge problems, eventually contributed to its collapse. China had huge problems, during the Mao era, huge problems even today, and that there's no reason to blindly apologize or say that things were worked out amazingly well when and gloss over the problems. There's no reason to do that. But if the premise of the conversation remains, socialism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried, stop. And that's what most leftists don't get. They don't get this. And so that's why I guess I'm a tankie. Do I defend every action that the socialist countries did? No. But overall, I point to them as part of my heritage, as somebody who's living in the United States, as someone who believes we need to develop socialism with American characteristics, a kind of socialism that would be specifically applied to U.S. conditions, as someone who believes in human rights and freedom and believes that, we should learn from the mistakes of the past. I consider the Soviet Union to be part of my heritage. I consider China and Mao to be part of my heritage as well. I consider, Fidel Castro to be part of my heritage. I consider the Bolivarians and what they're doing to be part of my heritage. I consider the Ba'athist movement to be part of my heritage. Overall, if we're going to try and build socialism, to build a better country for the working people of the United States, we can't not learn from what went on in the past. We should look into all of these socialist countries of the past, see what they did well, and see where they had shortcomings, and learn from them. And that's really what needs to be said. No blind apologism, but no dismissing. There's something that can be learned from studying what went on in the Soviet Union. And this desire to somehow gain credibility by saying, well, I'm a real socialist, I'm not like the bad ones, is childish, right? And it feeds into the myth. The reason that people don't believe in socialism in the United States is it has been pumped into their heads, just like it was pumped into my head, that the Soviet Union had no economic successes, that China had no economic successes, that everywhere there's ever been a socialist country, it's only resulted in death, misery, and starvation. And that mythology is simply incorrect. And if you never challenge that, if that argument of the right wing remains intact, then you need to give up, right? Socialism has had successes and shortcomings. And if you can't learn from any of them, if you just write them all off, you got to give up. The reality is we should study all of these countries and learn from their setbacks and failures, but we should try to develop a socialism uniquely applied to U.S. conditions, something that would be what the people of the United States would want to improve their lives. That's the reality, and that needs to be said. So I guess I'm a tankie, and that's why.